Good afternoon, everybody. It's really nice to see you. Thank you very much for inviting me to your wonderful country, your wonderful city, your wonderful festival. I've been having a great time over the last 24 hours. You've shared lots of things with me. I've shared my streaming cold with all of you. So hopefully I'm going to change that and offer you something that I'd like you to think about. So, I've been brought over from the UK to tell you about sex, or more particularly, the sexes. Mars, Venus, or Earth, just how different are the sexes? Now, I was asked to ask a polarizing question, but people think, well, we know the sexes are different. We've read books about it. We know right from the beginning that boys are different from girls, men are different from women. Everybody knows that, so that's not really a very controversial question. Hopefully, I'm going to show you over the next few minutes just how controversial it is. Okay, right from the beginning, it seems to be really important that people know what sex somebody else is. So right from the beginning, we have this tsunami of pink and blue cards. It's a baby girl, it's a baby boy. We dress these androgynous little creatures in somewhat bizarre, sex-appropriate clothing. We even give them different toys to play with. We give them different books to read. I quite like the juxtaposition of the beautiful girls' colouring book with little dragonflies and the brilliant boys' colouring book with rockets and things. It even turns out that we have to give them different ballpoint pens to write with. And so on and on and on. For some reason, it's really important that we label the sexes as different. There's a very standard go-to list that everybody has of the differences between males and females. You have your empathic, linguistically challenged, linguistic female who's very good at understanding people's feelings, but lousy at reading maps. You have your spatially aware, steely-eyed navigator who can't cry and isn't very good at listening. If you stopped anybody in the street, they could generate you a list of differences between the sexes within minutes. Why is it that sex differences are so important? Why should I think this is a controversial topic? Well, as it happens, I have given talks like this elsewhere in the UK and written about it, and it does generate a lot of controversy. People get very angry if you challenge this well-established fact that the sexes are different. So I thought I'd just share with you some of the responses I've got when I've been giving these talks before. These are UK-based, but they're probably general, and I'll keep an eye on the Australian press after today. So we have the Telegraph, a kind of august newspaper based in the UK. And when they heard what I'd said, I got a comment, this theory smacks of feminism with an equality fetish. Quite like the idea that if you're keen on equality, it's some kind of perverse practice. Daily Mail is a bit of a red top, cut straight to the chase, grumpy old harridan. The New Scientist, a fairly well-informed audience, one hopes, certainly didn't like what I had to say about differences between brains, or the lack of them. So I was called a post-menopausal affirmative active loser, and I've actually starred out the less polite part of that. Back to the Daily Mail, apparently I'm full of carp. Now, I'm assuming that's a spelling mistake and they're not referring to my fish-eating habits. Okay, so it's clearly a question that generates some kind of controversy. Let's have a look at it. What makes men and women different? We have an assumption there, they are different. Let's have a look and see how we've explained this in the past. Now, the chain of explanation is very straightforward, fairly simple, rarely challenged. Men and women are biologically different. They've got different genes, gonads, genitals. Therefore, they must have different brains. If their brains are different, then the skills and abilities that go with those brains are also different. So we go back to our spatially aware bad listener and our person who really finds it very difficult to read maps. And associated with that is the idea that if you've got different skill set, then there's different kinds of jobs you do. You could be a soldier, a hard hat builder, or you could be a nurse or a caring teacher. And there's fairly clear divisions have been accepted for hundreds of years that men and women are different. So what kind of explanations have been given for this? First of all, that biology is destiny, that the basis of all of these differences is the fact that we are biologically different, our brains are biologically determined to be different. So biology is destiny, and with it goes the idea that therefore fixed, therefore you probably shouldn't mess around with it too much. Also means that at the end of this chain, all of those differences which determine perhaps your place in society are also biologically determined, and therefore something you should be putting up with because that's what you've been born to do. So you need to know your place. So what we're really looking at is the idea that we've got differences between the brains right from birth, and that there's some kind of predetermined pattern of development which will result in these kind of differences, which mean that we have the kind of gender gaps which have been around for centuries. So you've got your nice little blue brain here, which as it grows becomes resilient, steely, armoured brain, which is fit for being a captain of industry or an admiral of the fleet, whereas you've got this nice little pink brain, which gradually grows, a bit marshmallowy, eventually lands up like a slightly bigger marshmallow, bit princessy, possibly more likely to cry. It is the case, as we will hear, that it's slightly lighter. Women's brains are, accept this as a difference, on average about 5 ounces lighter than men's brains. Lots has been made of that. Clearly, it's really important, if this is true, that it's properly investigated. How well investigated has it been? Well, if we go back to the 18th century, we see that science at that point was taking a fairly firm stand on the status quo. Women were socially inferior, financially inferior, and therefore they needed to find some explanation for this. They looked at the brain via a range of very weird techniques and came up with a fairly basic statement about what they thought about women being closer to children and savages than to an adult civilized man. How much we've moved on since then. But okay, let's not be unkind to the 18th century neurologists, even though they were all men. What we should also say is they couldn't properly look at the brain. They could fill the empty skull with birdseed and weigh it. They could measure bumps. They could do strange things with calipers, etc. They couldn't actually look at the brain. So maybe that was the reason for them coming up with this slightly alarming conclusion. Fast forward to the 21st century. So we've got a bit of product placement here. These are images that are produced by the kind of work that I do in the brain imaging lab back in the UK. Wonderful images, wonderful techniques that we have nowadays where we can look at different pathways, different structures, different areas of activation. We can look at changes in timescales of milliseconds. So we've got all these sophisticated techniques. We must be able to look at this question about difference in a more sophisticated way. Maybe we could even come up with more sophisticated answers. Maybe we should actually change the question. Not what makes men and women different, but are men and women different? Much more subtle question, and we have got the techniques. So I'm now going to share with you what I call the 21st century game changers, which should really be revolutionizing how we think about this particular topic. But I will also, I'm afraid, have to tell you that they haven't yet changed the game, and we'll see why. Okay, first of all, this is something that we've heard quite a lot about over the last couple of days. The fact that our brains are so-called plastic or malleable or moldable by experience. Biology is not destiny. We do not have the brain traveling along set tram lines from birth. Brains develop and change according to the experiences they have. I found this wonderful diagram on the internet from a 6-year-old. Everybody's brain is attached to the world. So everything that happens to you in the world will change your brain. It may well be that the experiences you have will be different if you're a man and a woman. It may well be that you play with different toys and your brains develop differently. You have different experiences at school, in jobs, etc. So that's why your brains are going to change in a particular way. So a gendered world produces a gendered brain. The thing that we need to remember is that the brains reflect the lives they have lived, not the sex of their owners. And I think that's really important to hang on to. So we can get rid of that link there. Biology isn't destiny. So that's one argument, one game changer that we have. How about the idea that we have males and females have different brains? A male has a male brain, female has a female brain. Wonderful study by Daphne Joel and team published just before Christmas, where they took over 1,400 brains, some from men, some from women. They looked at 116 different characteristics of those brains, all divided according to whether they were more typical of a male brain or more typical of a female brain. Then they took each of those brains and looked at those 116 characteristics in each of those brains to see how those different measures mapped out onto the different brains. They didn't find one brain that was all female characteristics, or one brain that was all male characteristics. Less than 6% could even be described as predominantly male or predominantly female. What we actually got was a beautiful mosaic. So every single brain was different from every other brain. And I think that's really important. So our brains are actually something like a mosaic. There's no such thing as a male brain or a female brain. And that's something that's really important to hang on to. So we can get rid of that part of the link as well. Let's quickly go to the opposite sexes. This idea that there's this go-to list which everybody agrees to, where we have our empathic woman and our map-reading man. Well, I'm going to quickly at this point, in case you're getting overexcited, just slip in a bit of statistics here. It may be something you're familiar with, but it's really important to understand this in the context of this argument. If you take measures from two groups of people, generally you'll get a distribution like this. If the two groups of people are quite different, you get this kind of difference between them, some overlap, but quite a big what we call effect size. If the differences are still there but less marked, effect size a bit smaller. If the two groups or the scores from the two groups actually overlap virtually completely, you get a tiny effect size. And one of the things that we now know with looking at big data sets, going back over all the past research, revisiting data, is that all the sex differences that people have reported, both in brains and behavior, are of this kind of order. So actually knowing whether somebody's a man or a woman is really not going to tell you very much. Knowing that a child is a boy doesn't guarantee that he's going to learn differently from a girl, and that's really important to hang on to. So where are we going this? We're going to look at this, the last link in the chain. The idea that we have these go-to lists which divide people into two nice groups, the nice binary divide, which is people are very fond of. These two authors here, who have great titles, I wish I could produce titles like that for my papers, have actually gone back over 100 different tests which compare males and females, and said, let's have a look at these data, let's see if they do divide nicely into two categories, or do they, in fact, divide more into single dimensions? And in fact, that's exactly what they found. There were some categories, I'll come back to that, but what they really found was that most of the things that we were thought differentiated men and women, fear of success, even scores of masculinity and femininity, a whole range of techniques actually changed what was going on. I did give this talk to somebody else and they said, you've ignored some of the really important categories. You're cherry-picking those categories which we know differentiate men and women. We know, for example, that there are no known examples of women stealing men's underwear off washing lines. You heard it here first. So you kind of think, with enemies like that, who needs friends? Okay, so the links are all broken. Biology isn't destiny. Men and women aren't different. We should move away from the idea that men and women should have different roles. So we can forget that idea, of course. Unfortunately, not. We still find that people believe that biology is destiny. You've got people who say that women can't do particular jobs because they're constitutionally unsuited. Nigel Short, well-known neuroscientist, apparently. Men and women do have different brains. This is a biological fact. Give up encouraging girls to do science. Apparently they're predetermined to prefer people to things and therefore shouldn't do science. Whole load of glass ceilings and gender gaps that you'll all be familiar with. So I won't go through these in detail because we already know that the kind of differences that the 18th century neurologists were looking at maybe manifest themselves differently, but they're still there. So something's still going on. Why is this the case? Now, if I was going to, in my closing only 2 minutes, talk to you about the gendered waters in which we swim, there'd be a whole other talk coming forth. But what I really want to focus on at this point is what I call the particular kind of books which really feed into this idea that fill our gendered waters. So we've got the kind of books from the Gurian stable. We've got Simon Baron-Cohen talking about the essential difference. Some interesting ones here I came across. Haven't read that one, but clearly somebody's got a clear idea. And the granddaddy of them all, Men Are From Mars and Women From Venus. We all know that. Sold millions. Now, I think these are actually very harmful, and I've termed them neurotrash, because I think that that's exactly what they do. They misrepresent what neuroscientists do. They misunderstand what we do. They peddle their wares on the basis of brain activity, which is very inaccurate, very out of date, full of things like right and left brain thinking, for goodness sake. Just in case you think I'm making this up and these are old books that nobody reads anymore, this is something I came across just last week in the Neuroscience News, which is a summary of papers, report on particular research. The brain regulates social behavior differences in males and females. Nice little helpful diagram so you know what they're talking about the brain regulating social behavior differently. It's only when you drill down a little bit and look at the details that you find out that actually this study was conducted in hamsters. Okay, moving on. Why is this important? Is this just an academic argument? I don't think it is. There's a part of our brain which we call the error evaluate system, which stops us making mistakes, which is, the really, not the feel the fear and do it anyway, it's the feel the fear and run away as fast as you can. Now, I call this part of the brain the inner wimp. And I think the inner wimp is something which stops us doing things. The inner wimp is fed by the kind of stereotypes that we surround them with. We know that stereotype threat changes the inner wimp. And if we have an inner wimp which is overactive, we become anxious and withdrawn. So to finish off, we need to get away from this idea of biology as destiny. And I feel that you're all a group who might go for some direct action. So I'm going to ask the conference organizers to actually get some stickers for you, and you can go and raid your local bookstores. So thank you very much for listening. Neurotrash is dangerous. We must fight it together. Thank you.